Greetings. Let's get started with acid bases in this lecture. Okay, there's a few parts to this lecture, but I want to make sure I can cover it with you from the ground up. So, start with basics. What is an acid and what is a base? What is the basic property of a compound? So we have gender, and this variable, uh, you can be either a male or a female, right? Or a spectrum. You have a variable temperature, right? And you can be hot or you can be cold, right? And I really like this example of temperature, but the way to think about acid and base is to think about temperature. Um, the ability to lose a proton, the higher that ability, the more acidic a chemical or a compound is. The ability to accept a proton makes a compound more of a base. And that's what it is. It's the temperature describes a certain property, and acid and base it describes another property. Proton. What is a proton? So remember proton and electron. You have a nucleus and then you have an electron around there, and the nucleus may have one or more protons which are positively charged and electrons that are negatively charged particles. So hydrogen atom is unique because it has one proton and one electron, right? So if I take that one electron, I end up with a proton. That's the only one that's remaining, and it's got a positive charge because I've taken the negative charge out. So that's why I can describe it as H plus. Okay? So again, that's why H plus plus an electron gives you a hydrogen atom. A hydrogen atom. And so if I take an electron out, I remain with a proton. Easy? Okay, perfect. That's all it is. How do you measure it? You know, when you have a variable, you want to measure it. So the way that this is measured is it's called a pH scale. Okay? And it's just like temperature. Temperature is measured with degrees Celsius or Fahrenheit, right? Same thing for pH. Easy, right? So it is a scale which is between 1 to 14. 7 is in the middle. Okay. Generally, lower numbers acid, higher numbers base. If something, and again, the spectrum is this side is most acidic and this side is most base or most basic. That's it. I promised I'm going to stay away from things that are complex and I'm going to keep it very simple. So that's how you measure it. Now, it is a relative scale. So what the heck does that mean? So let's say I have two compounds. One of them have a pH of 4, the other one has a pH of 6. Now remember, this is 7, this is 1, this is 14. Let me just change, right? So this is 4, this is 6. They're both on the acidic side of 7, right? This is acid. However, since X is lower, so remember I said the more closer towards 1 it is, the more acidic it is. X is more acidic than Y, right? Because the lower the pH, the more acidic a compound is. Fair? Makes sense. Now, what does that mean? I want you to think in terms of temperature, right? So let's say this is 0 degree, this is 100 degrees, right? The closer something is to 100 degrees, let's say, start with this first, and let's say Z and A. Wait, which one is hotter, Z or A? Z is hotter because it's closer to 100 degrees, right? So both are hot. So let's say this is 50. So both are hot because it's above 50. But Z is hotter than A, right? Now the other way to look at this is because A is closer to the lower number, right? A is colder than Z, right? That's the other way we say it. Well, guess what? If here X was more acidic than Y, they were both acidic, but X was more acidic than Y. The other way to look at this is since Y is closer to the base side of things, right? Y is more basic than X, just as this, right? Right? Or the other way to look at this is X is less basic than Y, right? So again, Z is hotter than A, right? A is colder than Z. Or, or, different way of saying it, Z is less cold compared to A. Or A is less hot compared to Z. Think about it. It's the same way of presenting this data. If you temperature and you can understand acid and bases in terms of temperature, the biggest confusing thing about this concept, you've slayed it, you've got it. It is acid and base, which is, let me adjust the size of my pen here, which is lower, which is lower the pH, higher acid, higher the acid, it will be less base or less basic. Increased pH, decreased acid will bring increased base. Okay. Why? You see here, as I am going towards less pH, I'm becoming more acidic and less basic. As I'm increasing my pH, I'm becoming less acidic and more basic. So, if I have X that has a lower pH, I am more acidic and less basic. If I am Y and I have a high pH, I am less acidic, right? And more basic. And I can write it out. But this is the central concept around acid and base, and the easiest way to think about this is temperature. And that's exactly what this says, right? You have X and you have Y, and you have cold and you have hot. And we just apply, just as we apply to the temperature. Cool? Okay. Like I said, that's the fun part about these videos. If you're not sure, re-listen to it and think, and it'll make sense. Now, this is not a chemistry class. We're talking about human body. So, let's talk about acid base as it's relevant to the human body. So, what is the pH of the human body? It is the overall ability to donate a proton. Same concept. So, I could have a high ability to donate a proton, which would make my body go into acidemia, or I could have a lower. I'm going to change colors here. Okay, or I could have a overall ability to accept protons, and that could be alkalemia. Okay, you guys with me on this? So that's acidemia and alkalemia. Now, this is the chemistry of the body of the acids that we just looked at. 1, 7, and 14. Remember pH? Okay. Now, human body is just slightly different. Not very different, just slightly different. Instead of 7, our middle number or our 7 is actually 7.4. So in other words, 7.4 is what our body considers the center point of the thermostat. You with me on this? The normal range, let me change the color. The normal range is between 7.35 and 7.45. So this is normal. So the body is always targeting 7.4. And as long as it remains between 7.35 and 7.45, I am in hemostasis. Homeostasis, sorry. Homeostasis. Or I'm in equilibrium. If I go on either side, I get into trouble. This is what I call trouble zone. Now, not only am I not at the target pH, I'm in the trouble area. Again, thinking about temperature. So remember, I set the thermostat to, let's say, 78 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperatures between, stays between 76 and, 80, and that'll make me happy. But anything outside will make the room too hot or too cold. Same concept here. Okay, any number less than 7.4 would be what? Remember we covered that. So this would be the acid side of things. So this would be acidemia, okay? Any number higher than 7.4 would make it alkalemia, right? So again, acidemia and alkalemia. So if I am on less than 7.4, I'm acidemia, right? If I am greater than 7.4, I am alkalemic. And then normal would be 7.4. And what's normal? What's the range that is normal? So again, you have 7.45 on the alkalemic side, which is a good range, and then 7.35 on this side. Okay, again, right? So you have pH 7.35, and then you have 7.45 right here, and then you have 7.4 in the middle, right? Now, whether um, the body, its overall acid in acidemia or alkalemia is determined by different processes. Okay? It's determined by different processes. Those processes that are there in the body that govern that tightly regulate the pH are called oses. Okay, so remember we talked about demia, emia. So emia is what is the overall pH? Oses is the process. Okay, oses is the process that causes emia. Let me write that down. It's an interesting concept. Oses. Oses contributes to the overall result of emia. Okay, very good thing to remember. Okay, so let's take a look at it. So there's two types of processes. There are respiratory processes and there's metabolic processes. Okay, so respiratory process, respiratory oses cause either acidemia or alkalemia. Metabolic oses contribute and cause acidemia or alkalemia. Okay, perfect. How do I measure the respiratory side of things here? I measured using partial pressure of carbon dioxide, which is represented as PaCO2. Okay, and so I'm going to try to represent it with blue dots. The normal levels are 35 to 45 millimeters of mercury. So remember pH was 7.35 to 7.45. You see after the decimal 35 to 45? That's what that is. So that's pH normal range. And this is PaCO2 normal range. Okay. How to think about this? Okay. Any of you ever had soda or made soda? So essentially you have water, right? And this is water. And then you put that water in a bottle and put high pressure carbon dioxide through it. And that's, that gets dissolved in water. Okay. And then you see every now and then those CO2 bubbles fizzing out. You drink any kind of beverage that is carbonated. That's what it is the carbon dioxide carbonated beverage. Carbon dioxide is dissolved in water or a solution, and that's bubbling. And so that amount of carbon dioxide that's dissolved in water, that can be measured using partial pressure of carbon dioxide. That's what that is. Okay, so now actually you know what it is. Okay, so respiratory processes are measured with PaCO2 and partial pressure of PaCO2, and normal is 35 to 45. Now, another process is virosis. So respiratory process that add acid would be respiratory acidosis. Respiratory processes that add alkalemia. Remember acidemia and alkalemia? Okay, that cause alkalemia are respiratory alkalosis. Okay, so CO2 plus H2O gives you H2CO3. That's carbonic acid. You have H plus plus bicarbonate, right? So H plus is a proton. This is actually an acid. So if I have more CO2 dissolved in water, I have higher acid. So when you're drinking soda water, you're drinking carbonic acid. Wow, interesting, right? So this is water, and this is normal CO2. So you'll have a level of carbonic acid. If you have high levels of CO2, see there's more CO2 compared to here, then what is the respiratory side doing here? More CO2, more carbonic acid means this process or this side is bringing in respiratory acidosis. Osis. The process is respiratory acidosis. And this is contributing overall to acidemia. What if you have low CO2? Means less carbonic acid, less carbonated beverage. So that means the respiratory sites, remember, more acid, right? Means acidosis. Less acid means it's bringing in less respiratory acidosis, or it's going more towards the alkalotic or base side. So it's bringing in, it is respiratory alkalosis, the process that's bringing in less CO2. And that's contributing to alkalemia. Remember, our basic principles have not changed. And what are the basic principles? If you're if you are bringing in less acid, you're bringing more base and you're increasing the pH. And that's what basic or alkalemia or alkalosis. If it's a process, it's alkalosis. If it's pH, it's alkalemia, right? That's the application of this. Okay, so more CO2, more acid, respiratory acidosis contributes to body's acidemia. Less CO2 means less carbonic acid means respiratory alkalosis, which contributes to alkalemia. Okay, with me so far? Perfect. Let's do the metabolic side. So what did we measure when we were measuring the respiratory side? We measured the carbon dioxide. What do we measure when we are measuring the metabolic side? We measure bicarbonate. And bicarbonate uh, is written down with HCO3 negative. Okay? HCO3 negative. When you look at your metabolic panel, and this is on the venous side, so when you draw blood from a vein, and you want to get sodium and potassium, right? And chloride and bun and creatinine. You're going to see a little value which is CO2. This equals bicarbonate in the blood. So you can measure this through the arterial blood gas. You just get blood on the arterial side, or you can get blood on the venous side. When you get blood on the arterial side, you say, this is my bicarbonate. When you get blood on the venous side, you look at CO2, and that gives you the bicarbonate in the blood. Okay? Normal level, 22 to 26 milliequivalents per liter. Remember we went through pH and normal pH, and then PaCO2 and normal range of PaCO2. And this is 22 to 26 would be normal bicarb. Okay. So again, metabolic side brings two processes. Metabolic processes that add acid are metabolic acidosis, and metabolic processes that add alkalosis or add alkalemia are metabolic alkalosis. Okay. How do I think about it? Bicarbonate equals Tums, Tums. Hey, why did I say that? Tums is an antacid here in the US. Okay. So why do you take antacids? Because they are alkalotic, and that's the way I think about it. They neutralize that acid in your stomach. That's why when you have this heartburn, you take tums, and it neutralizes the acid. So it's the yin to our yang. It's the female to our male. It's the cold to our hot. It is our base to our acid. So more bicarb or more alkalosis that is brought on by the process equals more alkalemia equals higher pH. Remember, if we go towards this side of the curve, we increase the pH, but we go towards the alkalemia side. Right? Okay, perfect. That's exactly what I'm showing here. High bicarb means alkalosis from the metabolic side, which is metabolic alkalosis, which adds to alkalemia. Less bicarb is what? Less alkalemia, more tums. That's less metabolic alkalosis, so it's going more towards the acid side. So it's metabolic acidosis. Remember, we have acid, we have alkalemia. So here, if I have less bicarbonate, I have less alkalemic, right? So if I'm less alkalemic, I'm going more towards the acidotic side because I'm not on the alkalemic side. So that's why I'm contributing to acidemia. Okay? Again, if you're not sure, it's an application of a very simple concept here, which is what? If my base goes down, my acid goes up. I become, remember, so metabolic side was bringing less space because I had less bicarbonate or less tums. So I was increasing acid and decreasing my pH, right? That's exactly what I did there. Less bicarbonate means more acid. Metabolic acidosis, meaning adding to acidemia, means lower pH, right? So it's the same thing. You're just talking about temperature. And you're saying if I add more cold, you become colder. If I add less cold, you remain hot, right? Here, if you consider CO2 as hot, if I add more CO2, you become hot. If I add less CO2, you remain cold. That's essentially what we're doing. Okay? Now, that's two of those. Now, there's another little concept in there, which is oxygenation. And I want to cover this right now. CO2 is not equal to O2. Carbon dioxide is not equal to oxygen. And so the other thing in the blood is actually the partial pressure of oxygen. Say what? Yeah, just that CO2 is dissolved in our carbonated beverage. So is the O2 dissolved in the plasma of our blood. And we can measure it like we can measure carbon dioxide, we can measure partial pressure of oxygen. That's between 80 to 100 millimeters of mercury. That's normal. Now, it does not affect the pH. Now, here's a question that comes up. Hey, Prashant, I thought I had a hemoglobin and the oxygen was attached to the hemoglobin. The answer is yes. There's oxygen that's attached to hemoglobin and there's oxygen that's dissolved in the plasma of the blood. One. Two, you need oxygen dissolved in the plasma, and then the circumstances dictate when that oxygen binds to that hemoglobin or leaves that hemoglobin. 3, if you don't have enough oxygen dissolved in the water or plasma of your blood, you don't have enough oxygen to, to attach to the hemoglobin even when the conditions are good. Okay. Lastly, you need oxygen attached to the hemoglobin for it to be transferred to the cells. So in other words, the oxygen that's dissolved in the plasma doesn't go to the cell. It has to be attached to the hemoglobin. Okay? So if you think about it, if you want your oxygen to attach to the hemoglobin, you need lots of oxygen in the blood dissolved in the plasma. So you need your PSO2 to be up, and then you need conditions where RBCs and oxygen become BFFs or best friends forever. And then they talk to each other and they attach. It's like dating. They start to date. And then when conditions become not conducive, they split up and the oxygen goes to the cell. And that's the game, is we have to have the oxygen and glucose go to the cell, and when they go, it goes to the cell, it no longer is best friends forever. Uh, it splits up, uh, and it is more conducive to pick up carbon dioxide, which it then takes to the lungs. In lungs again, conditions are there for the RBC or hemoglobin to become best friends with oxygen, so it leaves the CO2, and the CO2 goes from the blood to the alveoli and it get exhaled out by the lungs. And that's our respiratory process. Okay? But essentially, oxygenation is really important as well. You have partial pressure of oxygen, which is dissolved oxygen, which tells you whether the patient is in hypoxemia, low oxygen, or hypoxia, right? Hypoxemia is low oxygen in the blood. So it actually tells you whether the patient is in hypoxemia or not. Okay? So if you have normal oxygen, you're okay. If you have high oxygen, you're hyperoxemic, but it does not add to acids or it does not add or take away from alkalemia. Again, if you have low oxygen, you're hypoxemic, but you're not adding acid or you're not adding base to this. Okay? But it is important. I will look at it in a second. Okay? And it's important because you need this oxygen dissolved before it starts talking to hemoglobin. If you don't have enough oxygen dissolved, it's not going to talk to hemoglobin. In other words, even when the conditions are favorable, hemoglobin and oxygen will not attach, and the cells ultimately would be deprived of the oxygen that they need for aerobic respiration. Okay? All right. So that's quite a bit of stuff we covered. Okay, so let's do a quick review of this. We talked about acid and base and what they are, and the ability of the acids to donate protons and base to accept protons. We talked about how to measure it on a pH scale. We talked about high pH, so, and again, we compared it to the temperature, right? We talked about a relative scale. So in other words, how one compound, even though both are on the acidic side, one of them could be more acidic than the other. And if something is got more acidic property, they're more towards the acid side. They're moving away from the basic side, so they're less of a base and it's lower pH. High pH is moving towards the base side, so there's more base and less acid because they're moving away from the acid side. This is a very important concept, very similar to temperature. The hotter it gets, I'm moving more towards the hot side, I'm less cold, and vice versa. Human body, we talked about pH being normal 7.4, and then the normal range is 7.35 to 7.45, and we looked at acid versus alkalemia, right? And normal versus abnormal. We talked about the two processes. You have acidosis, or sorry, two processes. pH is emia, acidemia or alkalemia, and then the processes are osis. So there's two kinds of processes, respiratory and metabolic. Within that, you have respiratory acidosis contributing to acidemia, respiratory alkalosis contributing to alkalemia. You have metabolic acidosis contributing to acidemia and metabolic alkalosis contributing to alkalemia, right? Okay. Respiratory. When you think about respiratory processes, look at PaCO2. Normal PaCO2, 35 to 45. More CO2 means more acid. Less CO2 means less acid because CO2 equals carbonic acid equals soda. Okay? And if CO2 is more, acid is more, pH is, remember, lesser the pH, more is the acid. More is the acid, lesser is going to be the pH. Good? And we have metabolic processes which are measured by measuring bicarbonate. And we measure bicarbonate either on the arterial with the blood from the artery and it's bicarbonate or HCO3, or we can get blood from the vein and do a metabolic panel and look at CO2. Again, it's 22 to 26 milliequivalents per liter. The processes are osis, so metabolic processes, metabolic acidosis adds to acidemia. Metabolic alkalosis adds to alkalemia. Bicarb is tums. More bicarb equals more alkalosis equals more alkalemia equals higher pH, and vice versa. And last but not the least, we have our oxygen. And again, that's dissolved oxygen, which is required to be dissolved so that when conditions are right, it can attach to the hemoglobin. Normal partial pressure is 80 to 100, and it's less than 80, you have hypoxemia. When you have more than 100, you have hyperoxemia, but it does not either add to the acid or adds to the alkalemia of the body. It's just what's required. It influences it, uh, and we'll look at it how it makes the body overall the pH move, but by itself oxygen does not do anything to the acid or the alkalemia in the body.